On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed out on our earlier sessions with Oran Pamuk, Yotam Ottolenghi, Sharat Paul, Casey Schwartz, Marcus Dusotoy, Ajit Lalwani, and so many others, you can catch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. To tell you more about the stellar lineup of writers we have, please welcome festival directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
We are all of us so absolutely delighted by the enthusiastic response from around the world to our stellar new series, JLF, Brave New World. We look at the new life that all of us have to begin, the journey ahead, the learnings, the unlearnings through these sessions on books, on ideas, on mechanisms to cope with and to understand how things are turning around after the pandemic. I urge all of you to listen in to us, to engage with us, to send your suggestions, and to join the Brave New World.
Hi there, we've put together an incredible literary festival for you online, JLF Brave New World. All the writers we love most at Jaipur, Peter Frankopan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, have been joined by a whole galaxy of stars we've never dreamt of actually getting to the festival. People like Peter Carey, Evan Duval, Alain de Botton. It's an incredible lineup. Orhan Pamuk, Neil Gaiman, I mean really, it just goes on and on and on. Come and join us, Brave New World, every Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday evening on a phone or laptop near you.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our session today on JLF's Brave New World is on Susan Sontag, Benjamin Moser in conversation with Chiki Sarkar. Susan Sontag was one of America's great literary stars. Her brilliant mind, political activism, and striking image made her an emblem of the seductions and the dangers of the 20th century world. Her writings on art and politics, feminism and homosexuality, celebrity and style, medicine and drugs, fascism and Freudianism, communism and Americanism reflected the conflicted meanings of a most conflicted word, modernity. She was there when the Cuban Revolution began and the Berlin Wall came down, in Vietnam under American bombardment, and during wartime Israel. Sontag tells these stories and examines the work upon which her reputation was based, exploring the private woman hidden behind the formidable public face. Benjamin Moser is the author of Why This World, a biography of Clarice Lispector, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a New York Times notable book of 2009. His latest book, Sontag, Her Life and Work, received the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2020. In conversation with Chiki Sarkar, who is a co-founder and publisher at Juggernaut Books. Juggernaut's authors include Twinkle Khanna, Nobel Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, a Tony Joseph JCP Prize winner Benjamin, William Dalrymple, and Arundhati Roy. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. Do also follow our handles JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, or in case we drop off, you can find us on your YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, or on Facebook. Remember, we'll be back. Don't worry. Ladies and gentlemen, on Susan Sontag, Benjamin Moser in conversation with Chiki Sarkar.
Hi.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? It's fun to be doing this again.
Yes. And first, let me congratulate you on behalf of all of us. The Pulitzer. It's the big one. How did it feel when you heard the news?
I was actually right upstairs, right where I'm sitting now, and I was just watching Netflix, and I looked on my phone, and it had sort of exploded. And I had no idea, because there's not a finalist list. It's just, they just announce it. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's the sort of thing you do dream about, but in the way you dream of like winning the lottery or something. You don't really think it'll ever happen to you.
Is it going to change? I mean, we're going to move to, of course, the book that won you this prize, but I just want to, I mean, it might be too soon, but do you think it's going to change your life, this winning?
I don't know. What I hope maybe is that it'll make certain things about my life easier. You know, writers always struggle in all sorts of ways. And I remember V.S. Naipaul once said that you have to win prizes. You have to win prizes, because if you don't, the world moves on and they forget about you or something. And I think every writer is kind of worried that, like, okay, well, they liked my last book, but now they're going to hate my next book. Or, I mean, you know, that's how writers think. And I think that maybe, I hope it makes things easier. And it gives me a new name. You know, it's like getting married when you change your name, or like you become a priest or something. Like, it's always those words attached to you, and you know like how your obituary is going to begin. It's a weird feeling. You know?
So, Susan Sontag, I want to start with, I mean, one of the interesting things about Sontag is that, you know, when I was reading her extraordinary biography, I thought, gosh, Susan is more famous than her writing today. That, you know, that she's famous for being, I mean, she lives in that era where she's kind of famous for being famous, and there are more people, you know, everyone knows what she looks like and who she is and what she represents, but not what she wrote. When you got this project, when if I'm not mistaken, the estate came to you to ask you to do this book, right? What was your feeling? Did you know Sontag's work well, or were you just kind of a version of what I'm describing? Of course, I know of her, and I read some of the books back in the day. What was your relationship with Sontag?
That's exactly how I was. I mean, they came to me and I thought, wow, of course. I mean, for an American, there's no figure that compares to her. You know, she was so, people would ask me, when did you first hear of her? And I said, well, she's not the kind of person you ever first heard of. She was just always there. And of course, you know, I had read what I think any educated, literate American had read of her, which was really not that much compared to what I later read. I mean, I didn't really appreciate, I don't think, how vast her work was and how many different subjects, how many different genres. I mean, she didn't write poetry, but she wrote essays, she wrote novels, she wrote plays, she wrote films, she wrote just about everything. And so I didn't know that much. It's a real education. I mean, I think if you want to know about the 20th century and where we are and who we are in some way that really forces you to confront all those questions and figure those things out, there's no one better to read than Sontag. And even when you don't agree with her, which is often, and people often didn't agree with her in her life, she's always stimulating you. She's always getting you to think more, she's getting you to read more, she's getting you to watch more films. Like, there's this list in the New Yorker, if you want to Google it, anybody, because it's quarantine, so go for it. There's a list of Susan Sontag's top 50 favorite films. And now you can get them all online, basically, most of them. But I got them just on DVDs. And they were complete education in film that I would never have had. And I mean, I think I know something about film, but I mean, and that's true with politics, it's true with novels, it's true with music, it's true with dance, it's true with everything. So it's really inspiring.
So Sontag was, would you say that for America, she was the last great public intellectual? Is that what she was? Is that is that the standing that, you know, she was this eclectic, vibrant, extraordinary voice that moved from photography to fiction to psychoanalysis to looking at AIDS. I mean, she put her mind and her thoughts into kind of modern life in a way that like no other person has in America. Would you say that would be the way you would sort of describe her or define her for someone who didn't know her?
Yeah, she was somebody who had all these parts. I think you've named a lot of them. And I think in the introduction, he named a lot of the things that she was involved with and the places and the questions and the issues. And then she's also more than the sum of those parts because she's this fascinating figure. I mean, she's a famous diva in America. She's somebody that everybody has a story about. I don't know. I'm sure there's someone like that in India, but like she's also quite hard to compare. When I would travel around the world and people would say, like, who do you think is the Italian Susan Sontag, or the Chinese Susan Sontag? And it's really hard to think of somebody who is as present as she was in all those different areas. And it really is fascinating because at the same time you're getting this kind of literary, cultural, political education, she herself is this larger than life figure. She has all these lovers. She goes everywhere. She's always like in some huge political turmoil. There's always, she's fighting with the president in the pages of the New York Times. I mean, it's hard to think of anybody who did as much as she did. It's amazing. It's actually
really need drama to her life, isn't there? There's a dramatic quality to
it. I mean, I often got exhausted just reading about the drama, because I'm sitting here at my desk, I'm at my computer just writing my book. But like the energy that bursts out of it, of all these conflicts and all these things and all these love affairs and all this stuff, and she would do so much stuff. She would go to like 3 movies a day, and she would go to breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then she'd go out to a club, and then she'd write like 4 pages of her book. I mean, you feel really intimidated by it. But what's so interesting about her is that behind that facade of this incredible sort of nuclear powered woman, she's really human. She's insecure. She worries all the time. She's always having a conflict with her mother. I mean, that to me.
She's a complicated mother herself, isn't she? I mean, she has an intense, but in your telling of in the book, her relationship with her son sort of has permanently, in some ways, I wouldn't say misshapen her son, but the son is wholly sort of still very much in her shadow, isn't he? Who's a very accomplished man in his own right now.
Yeah, it's so funny. There's this one point. I mean, she is like a lot of mothers who doesn't want to let her child go. And she really can't in some deeper psychological way. And at one point, there's this big moment that he's going to move out of her house. And, everybody's kind of relieved that he's going to finally make his own way. And he moves next door, So that is kind of interesting. I mean, in a way that like a lot of people had that with her, that even if they tried to get away from her, she was so influential and she was so charismatic and she was so powerful that a whole lot of people, I would say 25 or 30 people probably said that she was the most important person in their life. Wow. And these people are old now, and maybe they just met her when they were very young, like they had a brief affair with her, or they never met her. Her books and her figure was so important. So a lot of people, I mean, she had this very magnetic influence that was really attractive, and it was also really hard for people who tried to move away from that and create their own identities.
The picture you draw of her, I mean, on one hand, you spend a lot of time on the writing and the work, and you, in some ways, allow us as readers to rediscover it and rediscover her intellectual importance. Because, of course, what happens with someone like Sontag is that she's so colorful that the life has taken over the work, hasn't it? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, in a way that, there are the stories, there's a long time relationship with Annie Leibovitz, there's tantrums, there's the sort of vivid beauty, and then it's almost as if all of that charisma has actually been, I don't know whether the word detrimental is right, but it seems that because it sort of certainly overshadowed that, the rigorous thinking, the writing, the intellectual depth of her life, right? Would you say? I mean, if she'd been a more person who did all the things she did, would...
Well, a lot of people are great writers, but they don't have an interesting life, I mean, a lot of people just sit home and do their writing, and they don't necessarily have that colorful life. I mean, I can tell you right now, this computer where I'm speaking to you from, it's funny, like if you could see into it, you would see thousands of anecdotes that I didn't put in the book just because I didn't want that to overshadow the work. I mean, when you have such a larger than life kind of diva personality, it's often, that's what people remember. You know, they remember, oh, she yelled at somebody in 1972. And that's really not important to me. It's not really, like, it's all in there because, you know, you're telling about a work and a life. I mean, that's the subtitle, her life and work. But you want people, I mean, I think a biography is successful if people enjoy reading it and learn from it. But then also, if it's a literary biography, they then get curious about the work. And then they go into the work and they discover what she wrote. Because you can tell stories about her. I mean, everybody in New York has a story about Susan Sontag. To the point where
yeah, it's overwhelming, and
it overwhelmed me a lot, yeah. Because some people hated her and some people loved her, and it was hard for me. Often people that I interviewed and spoke to would sort of want me to choose their side, and that's very hard.
So tell me, I was going to ask you a question about the writing, and I will, but I'm going to just use this. Is, you know, did you find that you had to dig very hard to get these sort of quite frank, even explosive stories and viewpoints and stuff about her? Or did you feel like you called these people, you went and met them, and they were just willing to talk? What was the actual process of sort of interviewing and investigating her life like?
Well, so my previous book was a biography of a Brazilian, Clarice Lispector, and who is not only a Brazilian, but she came from a Jewish family of refugees, very poor people who had come as refugees to Brazil in the early 20th century. And those people were a little bit more shy, you know, they were a little bit more reticent. The thing is about Americans, and particularly New Yorkers, is they love to talk. And you say Susan Sontag, and they talk for 3 hours. I mean, I'm not really exaggerating. They will just go on and on. And sometimes that is really useful, but sometimes that's also just a story that they've been telling. Like they go to dinner and they say, oh, you've got to hear my Susan Sontag story. And then it becomes almost like a automatic pilot. When I spoke to Annie Leibovitz, you know, Annie Leibovitz who was her lover for 15 years and who was, you know, who's the famous photographer. She had never spoken about Susan before, and she didn't want to. She felt like that was her personal life. She's a very famous woman. She has a real wall between her public work and her private life and her family. And, you know, I respect that, and I think that's something that as a researcher you have to respect. But finally, after about 5 years, I was walking down the street in Paris, and I got a call from one of her assistants saying, okay, she's decided to speak to you, and can you be in New York tomorrow at 3:30? And I said, okay, you know, I mean, when that sort of opportunity happens, you find your credit card and you get on a plane, like you don't really have a choice. And she really opened up to me in a way that I found really touching and really, really loving and respectful in a way that I hadn't always felt from a lot of other people who were just telling me these gossipy stories. And it's so funny, like we're in this age where we're talking to each other on these screens and it's as good as a thing as we have right now. But there's such a huge difference between actually like sitting and talking to somebody and speaking to them this way or speaking to them over the phone or on email. And but it's funny how like these screens sort of filter out so much of who we are and what we are, like not being able to smell people, not being able to see them, like not being able to touch them. It's something that I hope this all passes over us. And especially for people who do this kind of research, because there's nothing, you can talk to people all you want, but like until you actually see them and actually like you go to their homes, you meet their kids, you see their animals, you know, you see what kind of tea they like, or like that they're diabetic, so they don't put any sugar in it. Like all those little things that tell you kind of who a person is. Yeah, so it's kind of magical. Because why is it that way?
I I, I want to talk about Susan and the private life in a minute, but I want just one last. If you had to sum up and say, what was Susan saying? What were the arguments she was making in her writings that are still important, still relevant, still what we did? How would how would you tell someone like me who is really like you? I think I read Sontag as a student in college and haven't really read her since, maybe even in high school, I think. But I just don't, I think like, why would I read her now? Why should
I think
anyone?
now it's really funny. It's tragic, but it is interesting that when I was publishing this book last year and earlier this year, people would say, is Sontag still relevant? And I would say, well, because of this and because of that and whatever. And then this disease happened. And it happens that Sontag wrote two famous books about disease, illness as metaphor and AIDS as its metaphors. The first was about cancer and the second was about about AIDS. And when you look at these books, she talks a lot, just one example, she talks a lot about how the language that we use to describe disease can actually save or kill people. So cancer, for example, was considered a disease of unhappiness. When women got cancer, it was considered that they were sexually repressed and they were unhappy with their husbands and this kind of thing. And so what happened, the result was that a lot of women who got breast cancer, which is what Susan got when she was only 42, she almost died of stage 4 breast cancer. She realized that a lot of women who got this disease thought of it as a judgment on them. So they hadn't lived their lives well, they hadn't been fun and spontaneous and whatever you're supposed to be. AIDS comes along, and of course AIDS is associated with homosexual men, and so it's given this meaning that, oh well, it's almost a sin. It's like a denunciation from God. Now, what's fascinating is how she writes that disease always comes from abroad. I've seen this in India on Twitter as well, that a lot of right-wing Indians are trying to blame this on China. Donald Trump in the United States is trying to say it's the Wuhan disease, and she writes about the history of how diseases are given meanings, and they're often racist meanings. They're often meanings that are associated with people's sexuality or people's failure to do this or that. And what she says is, we have to be very, very careful and precise about the words that we use to describe everything. But particularly with disease, if you think that AIDS is something that you get because you're gay and you live in a culture where being gay is unacceptable, well, you're probably, and this happened. This didn't happen in a village somewhere. This happened in New York and San Francisco and London. People just out of shame, they went and died alone in their apartments. And so that is one little tiny corner of Sontag's work that when you read it, and then you look on Twitter and you see what people are trying to, they're attacking East Asians in the United States, for example, because they think that Chinese spread the disease. This kind of thing, the language that we use to describe ourselves and others, it's a question of life and death.
I want to come to her life and move away from the work. And the picture you draw of Susan, I mean, she's amazing, but she's also kind of terrifying. You draw a picture of an incredibly brilliant woman who could be ruthless to people socially, who had an incredibly toxic, long relationship with Annie Leibovitz, which became, you say in the book, or I think in the last time we talked, that, it was the thing that you kept hearing, that got Annie and Susan. It was just like one of those really ugly relationships that seemed to last and last and last. And so Annie Leibovitz was, of course, very financially generous to Susan, right? And if you believe that you've been a little bit ungenerous to her, you actually love her too much to be ungenerous. I don't think that, but you have been. You people have said that about it. How do and we've touched upon it a little bit. I mean, that that all these stories overwhelmed you. Tell me a bit about that. I mean, what do you say to those critics who say that you were unfair to Susan? That this portrait that you drew of her, the portrait of the relationship with Annie Leibovitz, was
Nobody
you
thinks.
look at the dark. You were ungenerous.
Nobody who knew Susan, truly nobody thought she was a saint. I mean, including herself. If you read her journals, there's 100 volumes of them in California that are available to be consulted in the library. She is very aware of her flaws, and it's one of the things that's very touching about her. I think we all have this thing that we know ourselves pretty well. We've tried to correct this or that. We know we should eat less and exercise more and be more patient and work harder, and etc. So she's not different from most people in that she knew that. The thing is, like, Susan is someone that I do really love her. I mean, she's an incredible force. And when I write about the things that she does that are negative, first of all, she knows they're negative, and she's the one that is affected by them. I mean, it hurts her relationships, it hurts her career, it hurts all kinds of things. But I think that as a writer, I don't mind a larger than life woman. I kind of like it. It's kind of fascinating to write about because she's so extreme. I mean, she's extremely brilliant. She's extremely kind. She can also be extremely cool. She can even be extremely stupid in a way that I find totally compelling because she had this reputation of being the smartest woman in the world. And of course, nobody's the smartest woman in the world. I mean, you might be on Thursday or Friday, but Saturday you might do something stupid. I feel like that's only human. And I think that when you read about these exemplary lives, a lot of what you're reading is about how they are sort of like you and sort of not like you. But if they touch us, it's because they're close enough to us that we can understand them. They're just more.
But the faults that you raise about Susan, and I remember there's this line that you put, which Salman Rushdie described. He said there's a good Susan and a bad Susan, right? And in fact, Salman was a beneficiary of good Susan, right? I mean, Susan sort of helped establish satanic verses in America as then president. But I want the bad Susan is properly. I mean, let me give you an example. I mean, this is a woman who's written about AIDS, about camp, about homosexuality, one of the great themes of her life. Personally, has an incredibly complex relationship and refuses to come out. And makes, she lives for 15 years with Annie Leibovitz. And when the New York Times calls her, I think she says, no, I'm not with her or something. She denies it. Where do you put? I mean, this is not just an ordinary thing about, oh, you know what? I wish I lost weight, or I'm so lazy, or you know what? I'm mean to my friend today, or I'm snappy. These are really, I mean, the things and in particular the relationship with Annie, or you sort of depict her as someone who is not adverse to living off Annie Leibovitz. I mean, I think you've sort of drawn that portrait. Annie Leibovitz paid for a very lavish lifestyle for Susan and Susan's entire family and everyone. So I want to return. I mean, it's not just, oh wow, she's a larger than life character and then she has these faults, because actually Susan's faults are like it's bad Susan, but also they have a bearing on the writing, don't you think, Ben? I mean, how do you deal with the fact that there is a woman who writes about homosexuality and then doesn't come out herself? I mean, what did you feel when you were grappling with this? This is a big theme in your book.
This is really hard because on the one hand, she comes from a culture where gay people are it's not really homophobia. Phobia seems like a fear. That's what it means, a fear. Gay people in America, I'm sure in India too, were invisible. There was no public visibility. There was nobody when she was growing up who would go on television and say, I'm a lesbian. I mean, that was unthinkable, really. It was unthinkable when I was a child. It was really not only until the 90s and even later that was kind of normal and nobody noticed and cared. But So on the one hand, I understand that she grew up in that culture where that was really difficult and complicated, and a lot of people suffered terribly from it. And I also understand that by the time that changed, luckily it did change, she was older, she was in her 50s or 60s, and it was sort of, she'd lived a certain way, and she had this culture that had, was not the same thing. But what happens, and what a lot about my book is explaining what it means to be in the closet. Being in the closet is it's not a one-time thing. It's not like I guess now you could put it on Twitter or something, but the thing about the closet is that it's a way that you negotiate the world. Because every time you meet a new person, and they say, "How's your wife? Are you married?" And you have to think, can I trust this person to say, "Yes, I'm married to a man," for example? When people ask about your children, do you say it? When people, your office, and you've started a new job, and people say, "Oh, bring your family to the company picnic, whatever, this weekend. Do you bring a same-sex partner?" I mean, it's all these things. Do you trust this person? Like, is this person dangerous? And so I think that changes so much. But on the other hand, with the feminist critique that sort of predates the gay critique, this is in the 60s and 70s, is you can't write, what's the word? Oh, it's Adrienne Rich who says, don't say the body. You have to say my body. You can't speak in this abstract, allegorical, vague form. If you really want to talk about people's lives and make a positive change in people's lives, you have to start with your own experience and be honest about it. And Sontag was not able to do that, and it really did affect her work. I mean, I describe that at length in the book.
But as her biographer, and there's one thing where you sort of accept someone's faults because you're immersed in their lives. But when it in some ways contradicts their work and their writing, what do you do about that? And I ask that because as readers for her today, as we read, let's hope that we all go back to reading Sontag, which would be the great win and the great effect of the Pulitzer is if people said, "Wow,
yeah.
I want to read." How do this is a woman who was kind of deeply moral in her writing, but then a bit of a sponge in real life, right? A woman who believed in freedom at all, incredibly, as freedom of expression, freedom of people's life. She was extraordinary during Sarajevo. She hated authoritarianism, and then she was a bit of a bully in her own life, right? A woman who spent a large part of her life writing about homosexuality and the other, and then had this sort of, not Victorian, but call it her generation, but she had a very, very traditional, I think old-fashioned, I think there were people in her world, in her milieu, who were much more, she came from an avant-garde, she eventually settled in an avant-garde artsy milieu. Someone like Annie Leibovitz was perfectly uncomplicated about her sexuality. Why wouldn't Susan? What do you do? How do you balance this up? And does that affect should we judge her as a writer? I think is what I mean. Should the life...
No, I don't think it's about judgment. It's about understanding. I think actually when you see this, I think if a biography is successful also, it gives you an insight into this work. So it's not going to be like, oh, this book is terrible. I think it makes the book more interesting if you actually understand maybe the stuff that she's not saying. Maybe you're understanding the motivation about why she's writing in a certain way. And I think that wanting people to be perfect in that way, I don't have that desire when I'm writing about somebody like that. I really just want to understand why. And I think that, so with The Closet, for example, just to come back to that for one beat, the critique of The Closet that comes from gay writers starting in the 60s is that if you're closeted, that means you're always lying. You're constantly lying about who you are, about your most personal life, about your family, about your, everything about you. You're lying about it. And that lying is very hard to separate from the lying that you would just do in daily life to try to get around. And the writer's obligation, and this is something that nobody says as eloquently as Sontag, the writer's obligation is to be honest. The writer's obligation is to bear witness, to tell the truth, to do the things that you said, go to Sarajevo and stand for, in that case, it was anti-nationalism, anti-racism, anti-fascism, and actually do it at the risk of your own body and your own life. And she did that in a lot of places. She unfortunately couldn't do it in that area. And I think that area, when we talk about a lot of the bad things that she did to people and stuff, I think a lot of it has to do with her real discomfort with herself. So I think my perspective as biographer is, first of all, it helps me understand certain things I wouldn't understand. But secondly, I feel bad for her. I just wish she could have lived in a society that made that not an issue.
We're going to move down to questions soon, but I want to end with this thing, which is, I think we live in an age where we do judge our writers and thinkers by their personal actions. I'm not saying that in a bad, I'm not saying that we shouldn't or we should, of course. You take the Me Too movement has really, this idea that what if a monster was a great artist? What would we do with their art? And Susan's not quite there. Of course, I don't think you can compare her with a rapist or a sexual harasser. But I think that same question actually can be widened, right? And I think it happened with when Patrick French wrote the Naipaul biography. And people, it showed a side to him, which was, he was an awful human being especially to his wife.
I disagree with that. I have to say, I loved him. I knew him personally. I knew that story. I think that there's a lot of different sides to that. And I think that he was a great writer, for example, and that he was a great human to a lot of people, including to me. And so I can't let that go entirely. I think. Well,
I don't know any. I simply, but at least in the Patrick French book, I think.
Yeah, of course.
Comes up.
I think.
Okay, but all I mean is, what do we do about this? What do we do when we discover that these great writers and these great minds are monsters? And this is, of course, an old question, and I'm saying it in this kind of cliched way, but I feel that it's now it's a question that because of Me Too has become more relevant. What do we do? Do we separate that out? Do we say, okay, look, there's the work, there's the person was whatever, but the work is extraordinary in its stands? Or should we in some ways read them should we make those judgments?
I think, it's one thing to make judgments when you have the full story and you have all the information. It's the time that we're living in now. And I know this has happened in India, it's happened in America, it's happened in England, it's happened in Brazil, it's happened all over the world, where somebody's life can get completely destroyed by some rumor on Twitter. I know people personally who've had their careers destroyed based on stuff that was objectively not true. It was stuff that there was an email, there was a phone call, there was something, and people have used this to destroy people's lives. And I think that when you talk about someone like Susan or someone like Naipaul, I think you have to say, did they have their bad days? They certainly did. Was their contribution far, 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 far greater than all this other stuff that they may have done and they may not have done? It's not really sure. There's always two sides to it. I think the rush to judgment that we're seeing now is very dangerous. And I think that it's actually setting back the cause of a lot of things that we care about. I think it's setting back feminism. I think it's setting back all sorts of things. If any denunciation on Twitter is the same as raping somebody, then, it stops meaning anything. And if you care about these causes, you have to care about that. And I think that you really want to look at a whole person. You really want to look at who they were, why they were unhappy, for example, what they were struggling with. I think maybe it's about trying to judge others as you would hope to be judged, because we all have somebody who has some story about us, or who has some resentment, or has some jealousy. It's as old as time, actually.
Yeah. And on that note, Ben, I'm going to start with some questions.
Sure.
because you have a ton. So I'll get through as many as I can. Sachdev Ramakrishna asks her. Well, I'm not sure. I'm going to read this out, but Susan Sontag was incredibly talented and complex. Her defense of Rushdie, her singular act thoughts on 9/11. Why is there only one of her on balance? I'm not sure that there's an answer. I mean,
I
that's what it
think that's
says.
a great question. And I think, like, thank you for asking that. I think that's something that, I mean, with Modi in India, with Trump in America, with all these things happening, like, we all, I think, are thinking, what can we do? What can we contribute as writers or as citizens to create a more humane society, to right wrongs, to bring people together instead of driving people apart? And I think that the model of the engaged citizen, not just the intellectual and this famous powerhouse, but she struggled with that question her whole life. And I think that there are a lot of people who do that in maybe smaller ways. I mean, I was watching Barkha Dutt in going around India. I've been following her on Instagram, interviewing these people. I think she went to like 25 states in this one car, through the blockades and through the thing. And I mean, it's incredible. She's doing this with one camera. She has like a driver and a camera and a microphone. And she's telling the story of all of India at a time of total societal meltdown. And, she's doing something, and there's tons of thousands of people who in their ways are trying to help out. But I do agree. I mean, we miss Susan, because what Susan did was she kind of oriented you. She gave you the basis. She didn't necessarily tell you how to think or what to think, but she kind of taught you how to think. And that's something that, I mean, it's a great wealth, and people miss her. I can tell you every day they write me and say, what would Susan think about this? Or what would she do about that?
And this seems to be the theme of a lot of the questions. Someone's asked, Om Prakash Parikh has asked, what would she have thought of Donald Trump in today's America? She called Ronald Reagan new daddy of California. And what do you think? How would she have dealt with Trump?
Well, I think it's important to say, and again, to give an Indian example, Hindu nationalism, for example, is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been around for hundreds of years. Trump is not a new phenomenon in America. He is a very typical American figure. The greed, the obsession with celebrity, the love of display, the cruelty, the imperialism. I mean, we've had that in our country for hundreds of years. And so you can actually see what she thought about it. I mean, I think she was absolutely appalled by it. She was appalled by the reign of our oligarchy and these cruel men who have perverted what we thought of as the idea of America. The idea of a country of equals, of a democracy, of opportunity, and kidnapped it. But unfortunately, I think one of the things Susan does tell us is to go back to the classics. The things that you think just happened on Tuesday morning probably also happened in 1811. And it was probably really similar. And there was probably a writer who can help orient you in a way that can help you understand what's really going on.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I don't know what you're reading at the moment, Ben, but I just picked up all my Everyman classics that I haven't read, and I put them on my bedside table.
Everybody's doing that. People are reading Tolstoy, and they're reading, Victor Hugo, and all these things. Like, because you work in publishing, and I did work in publishing at the very beginning of my career. Like, there's always a new book. There's always a new thing on Twitter. There's always, and it's really confusing if you don't have the basis that I think a good secondary school used to give people. Where you learned your Shakespeare, you learned your Bible, you learned your whatever. People don't really do that anymore. And so I think it's a natural thing. Like, we want to go back to the fundamentals of our culture.
And this is going to be one of the last questions. And someone asks you, what are you writing next? What biography are you working on next? It's Sonia. You're not going to do biography? Is that it? You're done?
Yeah, somebody told me once, she said, an older biographer, she said, biographies are like marriages. You can only do about 2 or 3 as the max in a lifetime.
There isn't a biographer who's done more than that.
I mean, people have done them, but the thing is, like, so Clarissa Spector, that was 10 years ago that I did that book. I still work with her work and her translations, her editors, her family, her whatever, every day of my life, including weekends. There's something I do for her. Sontag is the same thing. And so it is sort of like, it's kind of magical that these women are dead, obviously. But for me, they're not. They're very much an active part of my life. And so you kind of become, in a certain way, a caretaker of this legacy. But it's an incredible amount of work to do a biography. I mean, I did 573 interviews for this book, or people. I interviewed 573 people. I mean, that's just a lot of hours if you add that up. It's a lot of trips. So I'm writing now something about my generation of Americans. My idea is that I was born in 1976, that we were the last generation that came into the fullness of American empire, mm-hmm. and we saw it fall to pieces before our eyes. So we grew up when everything was great and we were the kings of the world, and it's slowly just gone down. And I'm trying to write about what that feels like.
And do you think it's going to come up again? I talk about this with my American husband a lot. Is the sun going to, I mean, how long is this decline going to be? He thinks it's going to last for, it's going to be a 50-year decline.
It could be. It could be. I mean, it's funny to talk about it in an Indian context because, you know, or I'm talking in France, you know, I mean, this is an old country. In some ways, it's older than India. We have the cave paintings right down the road here from Lascaux and things that are 40,000 years old. France has had its great moments. It's had its terrible moments. Same with India. I think that America, any really huge and powerful and enduring civilization, which is what America is, it'll be ruined and it'll come back and it'll be ruined again and it'll come back. That's just how history shows us it's always been. But I think what was funny is we thought it was permanent. We thought it was fine. We thought we'd figured everything out.
Oh my God, Ben, so is it a big crisis for you? Are you like sitting in your beautiful home in France thinking, do you see yourself ever returning to America?
I moved to Europe for personal reasons when I was, it's not that I left America. I would have been happy to live in America. No, it's not a crisis for me personally. I think that when you write about lives and when you write history, you know that things go up and down. So you know that writers, even the very greatest writers, can get these horrible reviews and fall totally out of fashion and be completely left for dead. And then with their next book, they come back. And I think that's how nations are too, in a certain way. But I do think it's interesting. I grew up with a certain sense of myself that I didn't even know was a sense of myself. It's the sense of yourself that you have that, like, you can go from Sri Lanka to Toronto to Buenos Aires and everybody speaks English. So you kind of naturally, it seems normal that you're kind of on the top of the world. And that's what we're taught as children. American children are taught that this is the best country, but you know, not anymore. I mean, it's totally changed. And now Americans have a crisis of identity that, well, I think it's different from India right now, but it's not that different. It's you know, you thought you had a certain idea of your country. You knew what was good about it. You knew what was bad about it. And now it's very hard to know.
I mean, I have to say I disagree with you. I think there might be ups and downs in a way, but there are moments in a country's life, right? I mean, there was a time where French was spoken in Russia as the language of civilization, and it isn't. And the reason you can speak in English in Buenos Aires is because of the British and their empire, and they no longer have it. I'm looking forward to reading this book, Ben. I hope you.
I still have to write it.
Yes, of course.
Maybe it's going to be a total disaster and I won't finish it. That's what's so funny about books. You never know.
Well, this is a book to be written. And so we look forward to reading that next book whenever it is. But
I hope it's
enjoy
not too long.
yourself in this beautiful house of yours in France. I was admiring your pistachio-colored bookshelves and this very elegant room.
And I have all my Sanskrit classics up here too. I don't know if you can see them.
Out
Up
of
at
your
the
place
top.
Sanskrit libraries, I see that.
That's
Turquoise.
all that
Yeah, I
library
love
they published a few
it.
years ago. But the
Yeah,
guy
they've
died.
now turned into the Murthy Library with
I have
Harvard
those
University.
too, but I don't have all of those. I have all of the other ones. I have not read them all, I confess, but I have read a lot of them. So, yeah, I mean, the world goes up and down, and so do people's lives. And so we just have to hang on, I think, all of us right now through this very hard period and try to hope that we and the people we love can get through it and then try to build something better next time.
And write great books.
Let's try our best.
Thank you, Ben. Bye. Lovely to
Welcome.
talk.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Chiki. Thank you, Benjamin. That was fabulous. And yes, I think our world leaders also thought they'd mostly sorted it all out with their nuclear weapons and all the trillion-dollar economy. Still, this itsy-witsy tiny viral decided to show them the other side. Yeah, and it's all changed. And lockdown, no lockdown, it sort of continues, and that's our new world. And perhaps if they sort of invested the same kind of money in medical research and scientific research as they do in all the weapons that they do across the world, maybe we would have had a different sort of ending right now. But thank you both. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Chiki. Thank you, Benjamin. And thank you for joining us all the way from France. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We thank our official radio partner, Red FM Bajate Raho. Please do remember to log in at 9 p.m. for our next session, The Sun and Her Flowers, Rupi Kaur in conversation with Supriya Dravid. A Canadian poet, illustrator, and author, Rupi Kaur touches a visceral chord in audiences around the world. She joins us at JLF's Brave New World to read from her verses and share thoughts with editor-in-chief of Elle and author of A Cool Dark Place, Supriya Dravid, on her poetry, her process, and how she's channeled her creativity in the times of COVID to connect with her audiences through free writing. For those of you who wish to stay logged on, we have a special sequence from our Jaipur Music Stage archives. Multiple award winner, singer and composer Sonam Kalra is that rare breed of musician who's been trained in both Indian classical and Western traditions of music and is equally adept at both. Sonam's music aims to give life to the concept of one universal voice of faith by blending the messages of Sufi saints like Kabir Das and Bulle Shah with the words of sacred poets from across the world. She's performed across the world at prestigious festivals, events, and venues. Please enjoy the music and remember to log back at 9 p.m. Thank you.
Let me tell you about someone I know. He's my savior and he lives next door. Every morning when the sun comes up, he brings me joy in my favorite cup. That's why I know, yes I know. Hallelujah, I just love him so. When I'm in trouble and I have no friends, I know he'll stay with me until the end. Everybody asks me how I know. I smile at them and say he told me so. That's why I know, yes I know. Hallelujah, I just love him so. And to call him I don't need no phone. I just tell him that I'm all alone. By the time I count from 1, 2, 3, 4, he's there at my door. And evening when the sun goes down and there is nobody else around, he sends me love and I feel so right. And I know everything's alright. Cause I know, yes I know. Hallelujah, I just love him so. ta, tuck it ta, tuck it dick it da, tuck it ta, tuck it ta, tuck it dick it da, tuck it ta, tuck it ta, tuck it dick it da, tuck it ta, tuck it ta, tuck it dick it da, dim tuck it dick it ta, tuck it dick it, tuck dim tuck it dick it ta, tuck it dick, tuck dim tuck it dick it ta, tuck it dick, tuck dim tuck it dick it ta, tuck it dick, tuck dim tuck it tuck dim tuck it dim tuck dim tuck it tuck dim tuck it dim tuck dim tuck it tuck dim tuck it dim tuck it dim tuck it tuck dim tuck it da tuck it dim 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 da tuck When I'm in trouble and I have no friends, I know to stay with me until the end. Everybody asks me how I know. I smile at them and say he told me so. That's why I know, yes I know. Hallelujah, I just love him so. And to call him I don't need no phone. I just tell him that I'm all alone. By the time I count from 1 to 4, he's there at my door. And the evening when the sun goes down and there is nobody else around, he says to love and I feel so right. And I know everything's alright. That's why I know, yes I know. Hallelujah, I just love him so. Hallelujah, I just love him so. I love him so.